Hey again. Still awake? Or half asleep with one earbud dangling off the bed? Either way, let's keep floating through history's so-called great battles. We've already had a taste of Marathon, Hastings, and Agincourt. Tonight, let's slide into the 18th and 19th centuries, when men in fancy uniforms decided that wearing tall hats somehow made up for terrible military strategy. And of course, we can't talk about battles that changed history without tripping over the big one. Waterloo, 1815. Waterloo, the beginning of the end of Napoleon's ego. So, Napoleon Bonaparte, yes, that guy. The little corporal who supposedly had a thing about being short, except he wasn't actually short. He was just average height for his time, which is somehow even funnier. Anyway, after years of conquering half of Europe and upsetting literally everyone, Napoleon had been kicked off his throne, exiled to the tiny island of Elba, and told to stay put. Naturally, he did not stay put, because Napoleon was not the kind of guy who enjoyed sitting quietly with a book and a seaside view. In 1815, he slipped off Elba, sailed back to France, and pulled off one of the most dramatic comebacks in history. The French army, instead of arresting him, basically went, "Oh hey, it's Napoleon. Cool, let's just follow him again." Within weeks, he was back on the throne. Europe collectively facepalmed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia scrambled to form another coalition to stop him, because really, they had all done this dance before and knew exactly how it ended. The final showdown came at Waterloo, in modern-day Belgium. Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, with the Prussians marching in from the east under General Blücher. Napoleon's plan was to smash Wellington before the Prussians could arrive. Classic divide and conquer. But, as with most things in Napoleon's later career, the execution was less than ideal. The ground was wet from rain, delaying his artillery, his generals were bickering, his cavalry charges got carried away, and his troops ended up throwing themselves against strong defensive positions like waves hitting a brick wall. Meanwhile, Wellington just sat tight, doing what he did best, stubbornly refusing to lose. When the Prussians finally arrived in the afternoon, Napoleon's flank collapsed. His Imperial Guard, the elite troops who were basically his emotional support soldiers, made one last desperate attack. When they broke, the French army dissolved into chaos. Napoleon fled, and within days, his dream of ruling Europe was over. Back to exile he went, this time to St. Helena, which was basically the middle of nowhere in the South Atlantic. Spoiler, he did not escape again. The phrase, "to meet your Waterloo," has since become shorthand for facing your ultimate defeat, which is a little ironic because the actual battlefield was muddy, confusing, and full of bad decisions, not exactly the grand finale you'd expect for one of history's most famous egomaniacs. But, hey, sometimes history ends with a whimper, not a bang. Stalingrad, when winter said nope. Let's fast forward a century. Different continent, different kind of disaster. Welcome to Stalingrad, 1942 to 43. If Waterloo was Napoleon's big ego check, Stalingrad was Hitler's, because dictators really don't learn from each other, apparently. World War II had been raging for 3 years. The Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, expecting a quick win. Spoiler, it was not quick or a win. By 1942, Hitler decided to make a push for the oil fields in the Caucasus because tanks don't run on fascist dreams alone. But along the way, he also insisted on capturing Stalingrad. Why? Partly because it was an industrial hub on the Volga River, but mostly because it had Stalin's name on it. Yes, that's it. Hitler basically got sidetracked by a giant game of my name versus your name. So the German Sixth Army marched in, expecting another swift victory. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The Soviets fought tooth and nail for every street, every building, every pile of rubble. It was brutal urban warfare. Soldiers nicknamed it Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, because fighting felt like chasing each other through sewers. As the months dragged on, winter arrived. And if there's one thing Russia loves more than literature about unhappy families, it's destroying invading armies with cold weather. Napoleon had already learned that lesson in 1812. Hitler clearly hadn't been paying attention. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive encircling the German army inside the city. Supplies ran out, starvation set in. Hitler, in his infinite wisdom, ordered the Sixth Army to stay put and fight to the last man, which is dictator speak for, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but my pride won't let me admit it." By February 1943, it was over. The German commander, Paulus, surrendered, something Hitler had sworn he would never allow. Over 90,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Only a tiny fraction ever returned home. The battle was one of the deadliest in human history, with millions of casualties. But it also marked the turning point on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Germans were in retreat, and Hitler's fantasy of conquering the Soviet Union was basically done. All because he couldn't resist trying to grab a city named after his rival. A quick detour. The Battle of Tours, 732 CE. Since we're already floating across centuries, let's slide back briefly to medieval France for a lesser talked about, but still heavily mythologized clash, the Battle of Tours. Picture it, the year 732. The Umayyad Caliphate had expanded rapidly across North Africa and into Spain. Their forces pushed northward, raiding into what is now France. Local Frankish nobles were understandably nervous. Enter Charles Martel, nicknamed the Hammer, which is objectively one of the cooler medieval nicknames, compared to something like the Bald or the Fat. He rallied a Frankish army and met the Umayyads near Tours. The details are fuzzy, but supposedly the Franks stood firm, their infantry blocking repeated cavalry charges. Eventually, the Umayyad forces withdrew. Christian chroniclers later hyped it up as the battle that saved Europe from Islamic conquest, which is, well, an exaggeration. The Umayyads were already overstretched, and this raid was more opportunistic than part of a grand plan to take all of Europe. But propaganda is powerful. Charles Martel's victory made him a legend. His descendants, including Charlemagne, built on that myth to justify their own power. So Tours wasn't world-changing in the moment, but in hindsight, it became one of those decisive battles that gets blown way out of proportion. And a side note, Sekigahara, 1600 CE. And since we're wandering globally, let's hop over to Japan for a bit. The Battle of Sekigahara, 1600. The short version, it was the big showdown that basically unified Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate for the next 2.5 centuries. Two rival factions clashed after the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord who had previously glued Japan together. On one side, Tokugawa Ieyasu. On the other, Ishida Mitsunari and the Western Army. The battle was massive, tens of thousands of samurai on each side, but betrayal played a key role. Several supposed allies of Ishida Mitsunari switched sides mid-battle, tipping the scales in Tokugawa's favor. Tokugawa won decisively. He set himself up as shogun in 1603, beginning an era of relative peace and stability in Japan. Which sounds nice, except that it also meant centuries of rigid social hierarchy, isolation from the outside world, and occasional peasant uprisings. Still, compared to Europe's endless wars, the Tokugawa period looks downright peaceful. So yeah, one battle decided the political fate of Japan for generations, all thanks to a few timely betrayals. And there you have it. Waterloo, where Napoleon's ego finally tripped on its own shoelaces. Stalingrad, where Hitler learned the hard way that Russian winters don't care about your ideology. Tours, which may or may not have saved Europe, depending on which medieval monk you ask. And Sekigahara, where betrayal helped decide who got to run Japan for the next 2 centuries. Each one celebrated as world-changing. Each one full of messy logistics, tired soldiers, and leaders with way too much pride, which honestly is what most of history boils down to.